I thought I was treating a patient, but I was really uncovering a truth no one in this city was meant to see. The first time I saw her, the monitors were already too quiet, the steady rhythm replaced by a flat, stubborn line that felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, not chaotic, not dramatic, just controlled, like something had been decided long before she ever arrived in that room, and everyone else moved like it was just another case, another loss, another chart to close. But I couldn't stop staring at her hand resting on the white hospital sheet, pale, still, untouched by the kind of struggle I had seen too many times before, because this didn't look like a fight that had been lost. It looked like a story that had been edited, and that was the moment something inside me refused to let it go. The room smelled like antiseptic and silence, the kind that presses against your chest, and I remember adjusting the 4-line even though it didn't need adjusting, just to feel like I was still doing something, anything, because standing there felt like standing in the middle of a sentence that had been cut off before the truth could be spoken. And then the doors opened, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the air, and everyone changed. Conversation stopped. Movement slowed. Even the machines seemed quieter, as if the room itself understood who had just walked in before I turned to see him. Victor Romano didn't raise his voice, didn't rush, didn't demand anything. He simply stepped inside like the space already belonged to him, like every breath in that room had been waiting for his permission, his presence pulling attention without effort, and I felt it before I saw it. The weight of power that didn't need to announce itself, the kind that rewrites outcomes without leaving fingerprints. He didn't look at the doctors first, or the charts, or even the machines. He looked at her, and for a second, just a second, something in his expression shifted, not weakness, not grief, something quieter, something buried so deep it almost didn't exist, and then it was gone, replaced by the same controlled calm that made people forget how to speak when he was near. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low, steady, the kind that didn't ask for answers so much as expect them, and no one responded right away, because there are moments when truth hesitates in the presence of power, and I realized then that whatever had happened here, whatever had led to this stillness, it wasn't just a medical case. It wasn't just another patient. It was something larger, something connected, something hidden behind layers that people like me weren't supposed to peel back. I looked at the chart again, the diagnosis too clean, too precise, every detail aligning perfectly like it had been written to be believed, and that was when the thought came, sharp and unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. This wasn't the first time. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the bed, and I heard myself breathe in, slow, careful, like I was already stepping into something I couldn't walk away from. Because somewhere between that silent monitor and the man standing at the foot of the bed, I understood one thing with absolute clarity, something no one else in that room seemed ready to admit. This girl hadn't just died. She had been part of a pattern, and patterns don't exist without someone creating them. I did not sleep that night, and it was not because of the long shift or the hum of fluorescent lights that always seemed louder after midnight. It was because something about her case kept replaying in my mind like a detail I had missed in plain sight, and the more I thought about it, the more it felt less like a mistake and more like a pattern waiting to be recognized. So I went back to the records, not because anyone asked me to, but because I needed to prove to myself that I was wrong. The hospital database was quiet at 3 in the morning, the kind of quiet that made every click of the keyboard sound louder than it should, and I pulled up her file again, scanning every line, every number, every note written by hands that had moved on without hesitation, and everything looked perfect, too perfect, like a textbook example of a rare condition that no one questioned because it made sense on paper. But medicine is not just paper, it is breath, it is reaction, it is resistance. And she had shown none of that. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, then I searched her name again, this time not for her file, but for anything connected to it. And that was when I saw the second record, 2 years earlier, different name, same diagnosis, same progression, same ending, and my stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. I opened that file, my fingers slower now, more careful, like I was stepping into something fragile, and the details lined up in a way that felt impossible to ignore. The same symptoms, the same timing, the same final notes written in the same detached tone, and then I saw the last name. Romano. I froze for a second, my mind trying to catch up with what I was seeing, And then I checked again, cross-referencing, confirming, because there are coincidences, and then there are patterns that refuse to be dismissed, and this was not coincidence. 2 daughters, 2 years apart. Same diagnosis. Same outcome. I exhaled slowly, my hand resting on the desk as I stared at the screen, and a quiet realization settled in, heavier than anything I had felt in that hospital before. This had happened before, and no one had stopped it. I should have closed the files. I should have walked away. That would have been the smart thing to do, the safe thing, the thing that people who wanted to keep their lives simple would choose without hesitation. But instead I kept digging, pulling up lab results, comparing numbers, looking for anything that did not fit. And there it was, small, almost invisible, the kind of detail that could be overlooked if you were not looking for it. A fluctuation in a marker that did not align with the diagnosis, something that suggested interference rather than illness. My heart started to beat a little faster, not out of fear, but out of certainty, because once you see something like that, you cannot unsee it. And suddenly the silence in that hospital felt different, not empty, but controlled, like answers had been carefully placed out of reach. I glanced over my shoulder even though no one was there, the hallway outside still and dim. And for the first time since I started working here, I felt like I was not just part of a system, I was inside something that had already decided what the truth was allowed to be. And somewhere in this city, a man who controlled everything that moved within it was about to lose another daughter. And I was the only one who seemed to realize that it was not fate doing it. It was something far more deliberate. I should have stopped when I saw the second file. But patterns have a way of pulling you deeper. And once you recognize them, they start connecting themselves whether you want them to or not. So I kept going, cross-checking timestamps, lab entries, physician notes, looking for anything that tied the 2 cases together beyond coincidence. And what I found was not dramatic, not obvious, just small consistencies that felt too precise to be random. The same attending physician signing off on both cases, the same lab department processing critical results, the same sequence of updates entered into the system within minutes of each other, as if they had been prepared in advance rather than observed in real time. And the more I looked, the more it felt like I was reading something constructed instead of something lived. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I pulled up internal access logs, something most people never think to check, something I was technically not supposed to access without authorization. But by that point, rules felt less important than the truth hiding behind them. And there it was, a name attached to both files, not in the main chart, not in the visible notes, but buried in administrative edits. Someone who had accessed and modified both records at critical moments. Someone who had the clearance to move through the system without question. And the moment I read it, a cold realization settled into my chest. It was not a stranger. It was not an outsider. It was someone inside this hospital, someone who knew exactly how to make something look natural when it was anything but. I leaned back slowly, the chair creaking under me, and for a second, the room felt smaller, the walls closer, like the space itself was reacting to what I had just uncovered. And I thought about Victor Romano, about the way he had stood in that room, controlled, untouchable, a man who did not ask twice because he never had to. And I wondered if he knew, if he had any idea that the truth about his daughters was not just hidden. It was being maintained, carefully, deliberately, by someone he trusted to keep his world running smoothly. The clock on the wall ticked past 4 a.m, each second louder than the last, and I realized that whatever this was, it was not finished, because there was still one name left in the system, one more Romano file that had not been closed, one more daughter who had not yet followed the same path, and the thought hit me with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. This was not something that had happened twice. This was something that was about to happen again. I stood up too quickly, the chair rolling back slightly, and grabbed the nearest chart to confirm what I already knew, my eyes scanning for the name that would make everything real. And when I found it, my breath caught in a way I could not control. Sophie Romano, admitted 6 hours ago. Same preliminary diagnosis. Same early markers. Same quiet progression that no one else seemed to question. I closed my eyes for a second, steadying myself, because now it was no longer about understanding what had already happened. It was about what was about to happen next, and whether I was willing to step into something that could not be undone. Outside, the first light of morning began to push through the hospital windows, soft, almost peaceful, but inside, Everything felt sharper, heavier, like the calm before something irreversible, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I did nothing, history would repeat itself with the same quiet precision it always had, and no one would ever call it what it really was. I did not give myself time to think about whether I was making a mistake, because the moment I saw her name in the system, the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere instinctive, the part of me that refuses to watch something happen twice when there is still a chance to stop it. And before I could talk myself out of it, I was already walking down the hallway toward her room, each step steady, even though my thoughts were anything but. The early morning light filtered through the tall windows, soft and almost peaceful, but it felt out of place here, like it did not belong in a place where something so precise and hidden was unfolding. And as I approached the door, I slowed, not out of hesitation, but because I needed to see her before anyone else could shape what this situation meant. Sophie Romano was smaller than I expected, lying quietly against the white pillows, her breathing even, her face calm in a way that would have reassured anyone who did not know what to look for. But I did, and the moment I stepped closer, I felt it again, that same absence, that same unnatural stillness beneath the surface, like her body was following a script instead of reacting to a condition. I checked her chart, the digital screen glowing softly beside her bed, and everything matched what I had already seen. The same diagnosis beginning to take shape, the same notes, the same progression already being written before it had fully happened, and my chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from certainty, because now it was no longer a theory, it was happening again in real time. "You should not be in here alone," a voice said behind me, low, controlled, unmistakable, and I did not need to turn to know who it was. Victor Romano did not announce his presence. He altered the space around him, and I felt it shift before I even met his eyes, the air heavier, the silence sharper, as if everything in the room was waiting for his reaction before continuing. I turned slowly, keeping my movements deliberate, because rushing would have made this something it was not, and when I looked at him, I saw the same control, the same unreadable calm, but there was something else now, something beneath it, something that had been there before but was harder to ignore with his last daughter lying in front of him. "She is stable," I said, my voice even, matching his tone, not challenging, not submitting, just stating what was visible, and he held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring something I had not yet said. "That is what they told me last time," he replied, and the weight of those words settled between us, quiet but undeniable, because this was not new for him, even if the truth behind it still was. I glanced back at Sophie, then at the chart, then back at him, and I knew there was a line I was about to cross, one that could not be uncrossed once spoken aloud. But silence felt like complicity now, and I had already gone too far to pretend I had not seen what I had seen. "This is not a coincidence," I said finally, the words steady, controlled, but carrying more than just observation. And for the first time since he entered the room, something in his expression shifted, not visibly to anyone else, but enough for me to notice, enough to know that he heard what I was really saying. The room felt smaller after that, the distance between truth and consequence closing in a way that made every second count. And as he stepped closer to the bed, his attention returning to his daughter, I realized that whatever happened next would not just change what he believed about this situation, it would change everything he thought he controlled, because power can silence people, it can shape narratives, it can erase mistakes, but it cannot protect you from a truth that has already begun to surface. I could feel the shift the moment the words left my mouth, not loud, not dramatic, but real, like something invisible had been pulled into the open where it could no longer hide behind polished reports and controlled silence. And Victor did not respond right away, which told me more than anything he could have said, because men like him did not pause unless something had interrupted the certainty they lived by. He stood there, looking at Sophie, but I knew he was not just seeing his daughter anymore. He was measuring everything that had led to this moment, every decision, every person he had trusted, every system he believed was working exactly as it should, and for the first time, there was doubt in the room, quiet but undeniable. "Explain," he said finally, his voice lower now, not sharper, not louder, just heavier, like each word carried weight it did not before, and I took a slow breath. because this was the point where observation became accusation, and there was no safe way to deliver that truth. Your daughters were not treated differently, I said carefully, choosing each word with precision. They were processed the same way, same diagnosis, same progression, same timeline, and that does not happen naturally. Not twice. Not like this. He turned his head slightly, just enough to look at me directly, and his eyes were not angry, not yet, but focused in a way that made it clear he was listening to everything I was not saying as much as what I was. You are suggesting what? He asked, and the space between us felt tighter, like the room itself was holding its breath, and I realized that once I said it, there would be no going back to being just another nurse in just another hospital. I am suggesting that someone is controlling the outcome, I said, steady, even though my pulse had started to rise. Someone with access, someone inside the system, someone who knows exactly how to make it look like a medical condition when it is not. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, filled with everything that had not yet been spoken, and I watched as something in his posture changed, subtle, almost invisible, but enough to signal that this was no longer just about medicine. This was about trust, about control, about the possibility that the one thing he believed he could always manage had been compromised without him knowing. He looked back at Sophie, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the bed, not touching her, just close enough to remind himself she was still there, still within reach. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something quieter, something that did not belong to the version of him the city feared. Who? He asked, and that single word carried more weight than any demand, because it was not just a question, it was a line drawn, a point of no return. I hesitated for half a second, not because I did not know, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way neither of us could ignore. And then I met his eyes again, steady, certain, because truth does not soften itself to make people comfortable. I do not have the full answer yet, I admitted, but I have a name in the system, someone who accessed both cases at critical points, someone who should not have needed to intervene unless there was something to hide. His gaze sharpened slightly, not with anger, but with focus, the kind that meant decisions were already forming beneath the surface, and I understood then that whatever this was, it had just moved beyond me, beyond the hospital, into a world where consequences were not written in charts, but decided in silence. The machines continued their quiet rhythm beside us, steady, indifferent, but everything else had changed, because now the truth was no longer hidden in data. It was standing in the same room as a man who had built his life on control, and for the first time, he was facing something he had not seen coming. Victor did not ask another question, and that was what unsettled me the most, because men like him were not known for patience, yet he stood there in silence, absorbing everything, as if he understood that rushing now would only push the truth further out of reach. And when he finally moved, it was not toward me, but toward the door, his presence shifting the room as he stepped into the hallway, and without thinking, I followed. Because whatever this was, I was already part of it whether I wanted to be or not. The corridor outside felt colder, brighter, the early morning staff moving in controlled routines, unaware that something far more serious than a patient case had just begun to unfold, and Victor stopped near the nurse station, his gaze sweeping across the space, not searching randomly, but deliberately, like he already knew where to look even if he did not yet know what he would find. The name, he said without turning to me, his voice quiet but absolute, and I felt the weight of that request settle in, because this was the moment where information became consequence, where a name stopped being just data and became a target for answers that would not be asked gently. Dr. Alan Reeves, I said, keeping my tone steady, and even saying it out loud felt different, heavier, more real than it had when it was just a line on a screen. Victor nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if committing it to memory was enough to set something in motion, and I realized then that whatever happened next would move faster than anything I could control. He accessed both cases. I continued, because stopping now would have been worse than starting, not as the primary physician, but through administrative overrides, adjusting records, timing entries, making everything align perfectly with the diagnosis. Victor finally turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his profile, sharp, composed, but there was something colder. Beneath it now, not anger, not yet, but clarity, the kind that comes when uncertainty begins to disappear. "And you are certain?" he asked, not questioning my competence, but measuring my conviction, and I met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," I said, because doubt would only weaken the truth, and I had seen too much to pretend otherwise. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the hospital continued around us like nothing had changed, carts rolling, monitors beeping in distant rooms, voices low and routine. But in that small space between us, everything had shifted into something far more dangerous, something that could not be undone once it fully surfaced. Victor straightened slightly, his shoulders settling into a posture that felt less like a father and more like the man the city whispered about, the one who did not lose control, the one who corrected anything that threatened it. And yet there was still something different now, something personal woven into that control that made it sharper, more focused. "No one touches her treatment plan without going through you," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a finality that left no room for interpretation. And I realized he was not just giving an order, he was drawing a boundary around his daughter, one that no one would cross without consequence. I nodded before I could second-guess it, because refusing was not an option, not anymore. And as he turned to walk down the hallway, already moving towards something I could not see, I understood that the truth I had uncovered was no longer hidden in files or patterns. It was active now, moving, reacting, and somewhere in this hospital, the person behind it had no idea that the system they controlled had just begun to turn against them. I expected chaos after that, some visible reaction, some shift in the hospital that matched the weight of what had just been set into motion. But nothing changed on the surface, and that was what made it worse, because when something dangerous hides in plain sight, it does not announce itself. It continues like everything is normal until it is too late to stop it. I returned to Sophie's room, the door closing softly behind me. And for a moment, it felt like stepping into a different world, one where time moved slower, where the quiet hum of machines replaced the tension building outside, and she was still there, exactly as I had left her, breathing steady, peaceful, untouched by the urgency that now surrounded her. I moved closer, checking her vitals again, not because they had changed, but because I needed to confirm that I still had control over something, anything, and everything looked stable. Almost reassuring, if I did not already know how misleading that could be. I adjusted the monitor slightly, watching the numbers flicker in response, and that was when I noticed it, subtle, almost insignificant, a minor fluctuation that most people would dismiss as normal variation. But I had seen this pattern before, twice, and I knew what came after. My hand paused mid-movement, and a quiet realization settled in, sharper than anything I had felt before. Because whatever process was happening, it had already begun, and time was no longer on our side. I reached for the chart again, scanning the most recent updates, and something new stood out, an entry added just minutes ago, clean, precise, signed under Dr. Alan Reeves, and my chest tightened slightly, because that meant he was here, not somewhere in the system, not behind a screen, but physically inside this hospital, moving through the same halls, possibly watching the same monitors, controlling the same narrative in real time. The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature, and I glanced toward the door instinctively, the quiet of the room suddenly feeling less like calm and more like isolation, because if he was here, then this was not just a pattern being repeated, it was a process being executed again with the same confidence, the same precision, as if nothing could interfere with it. Footsteps passed outside, distant but steady, and I held my breath for a second, listening, measuring, trying to separate normal from intentional. But that was the problem. Everything sounded normal, and that was exactly how something like this could continue without being questioned. I stepped back slightly, my eyes moving between Sophie and the door, and for the first time since I started following this pattern, doubt crept in, not about what was happening, but about whether I was already too late to stop it, because uncovering the truth is one thing, but interrupting it while it is still unfolding is something else entirely. The monitor let out a soft, consistent rhythm, steady, controlled, and I realized with a clarity that left no room for hesitation that if I waited for proof, for confirmation, for the kind of certainty that people rely on before they act, then I would be watching the same ending play out for the third time. And this time, I would know exactly when it started and still fail to change it. I moved closer again, my focus narrowing, blocking out everything else, because this was no longer about the system or the name in the file or the pattern in the data. It was about this moment, this patient, this chance to break something that had been repeating itself too perfectly for too long. And as I adjusted the settings manually, overriding what had already been entered, I understood that I was no longer just observing what was happening inside this hospital. I was interfering with it. And somewhere, someone who believed they controlled every outcome was about to realize that something had changed. I knew the moment I changed those settings that I had crossed a line no one had asked me to cross, but it did not feel reckless. It felt necessary, like stepping in front of something already in motion and refusing to let it continue just because it had always been allowed to. And as the system processed my override, the screen flickered slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that something had been altered, something that was not supposed to be touched. The monitor beside Sophie responded almost immediately, not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm anyone passing by, but enough for me to see it, the rhythm adjusting, the pattern shifting away from the quiet, controlled decline I had come to recognize, and my breath slowed just a fraction, not in relief, but in focus, because this was not over. This was only the moment where the script had been interrupted. A soft sound came from the terminal behind me, a notification I had never seen before, not part of the usual system alerts, something internal, something administrative, and I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the screen as a small window appeared, requesting confirmation for the changes I had already made. But the language was different, too precise, too immediate, as if the system itself was questioning my authority to interfere. I hesitated for less than a second before confirming it, my finger pressing the key with a steadiness I did not feel inside, and the window disappeared, but the silence that followed was heavier than before, like the system had not just accepted the change, it had noticed it. Footsteps stopped outside the door, not passing this time, not distant, but right there, just beyond the frame, and I felt it before I heard anything else, that shift in presence, that quiet pressure that meant someone had arrived with intention, not coincidence. The door opened slowly, not rushed, not forced, just deliberate, and Dr. Alan Reeves stepped inside as if he had every right to be there, which technically, he did, but something about the way he moved made it clear that this was not routine, this was response. He was exactly as I expected and nothing like I wanted him to be, composed, professional, calm in a way that felt practiced rather than natural, his eyes scanning the room quickly before settling on me, not surprised, not confused, just aware, like he had already been informed of something before he walked in. "You made an adjustment," he said, his tone neutral, not accusing, not questioning, just stating a fact, and I realized then that whatever system he had been using, it had already alerted him, already told him that something had changed in a place he believed was fully under control. "I corrected a discrepancy," I replied, keeping my voice even, matching his calm with my own, because anything less would have shifted the balance in a way I could not afford. His gaze moved briefly to the monitor, then back to me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, but the silence between us was not empty. It was layered with everything we both understood without saying it, that this was no longer about a patient. It was about a process, a pattern, a system that had just been interrupted by someone who was not supposed to see it clearly enough to act. "These cases require consistency," he said finally, his words careful, controlled. "Deviations can create complications." And the way he said complications made it sound less like a medical concern and more like a warning, subtle, but intentional. I held his gaze, steady, refusing to step back into uncertainty now that I had already stepped forward. "So can repetition," I replied quietly. And something in his expression shifted, not visibly to anyone else, but enough for me to see it, enough to know that he understood exactly what I meant. Behind us, the monitor continued its adjusted rhythm, steady, different, alive in a way it had not been before, and for the first time since this began, the pattern had not followed its expected path, and standing there between the system that had been altered and the man who had been controlling it, I understood that this was the moment where the truth stopped hiding and started resisting. The silence between us did not break. It tightened, like something invisible had drawn a line neither of us could step back from. And for a moment, the only sound in the room was the steady rhythm of the monitor, no longer following the pattern it had been locked into before, but something new, something uncertain, something alive, and I saw it in his eyes. Not fear, not panic, but recognition. The kind that comes when control begins to slip in ways you cannot immediately correct. Dr. Reeves took a slow step closer to the monitor, his attention shifting briefly from me to the numbers on the screen. And for the first time since he walked in, there was a pause in his composure, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm what I already knew. This was not supposed to happen. You do not understand what you are interfering with, he said quietly, and there was no anger in his voice, just certainty, the kind that comes from someone who has never been challenged in a system they helped build. And I realized then that whatever this was, it had never been questioned before, not like this. Then explain it, I replied, because stepping back now would have meant accepting something I had already proven was not natural. And he held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, as if deciding whether I was worth the truth or just another variable to be managed. Before he could answer, the door opened again, and the shift in the room was immediate, heavier, more final, because Victor Romano did not enter spaces quietly anymore, not after what had just been set into motion, and when his eyes moved from Reeves to the monitor and then to me, the understanding was instant, not spoken, but clear. Enough that nothing needed to be repeated. It is different, he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying something deeper now, something that had not been there before, and I nodded once, because this was the first moment where the pattern had failed to repeat itself exactly, and that alone changed everything. Reeves straightened slightly, his composure returning, but it was no longer untouched. There was a tension beneath it now, something calculated, something aware that the situation had shifted beyond simple correction. Temporary variations can occur, he said, his tone measured, but the words felt rehearsed, less certain than before, and Victor's gaze remained fixed on him, unblinking, unreadable, the kind of silence that forces truth to surface whether you intend it to or not. You accessed both cases, Victor said finally, not asking, not accusing, just stating it as fact, and the weight of that statement settled into the room like something irreversible, because once spoken, it could not be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. Reeves did not deny it immediately, and that hesitation, that single moment of delay, was enough to shift the balance completely, because in that silence, the truth revealed itself more clearly than any explanation could have. I felt my pulse slow, not from calm, but from clarity, because everything that had been hidden in data and patterns was now standing in front of us, exposed in a way that could not be rewritten or adjusted. The monitor continued its steady rhythm behind us, consistent, stable, unchanged by the tension in the room, and I realized that for the first time, the outcome was no longer predetermined, it was uncertain, and that uncertainty was the one thing the system had never accounted for. Victor took one step closer, not toward me, not toward the bed, but toward Reeves, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but far more final. You will explain everything, he said, and it was not a threat, not in the way most people would understand. It was something else entirely, something absolute, something that did not need to be enforced because it already was. I looked at Sophie one more time, her breathing steady, her presence anchoring everything that had just changed, and I understood then that this was never just about uncovering what had been hidden, it was about breaking something that had been repeating itself without question, and now that it had been broken, nothing in this city would ever move the same way again, because power can control outcomes for a long time, but the moment truth interrupts it, even once, it changes what is possible forever.